Good morning, Mel. It's really nice to see you again. We're back again.
We're back again. Here we are. It's lovely. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. The weather's been beautiful. As I was just mentioning to you before we started, I've been taking your advice and sitting out in the early morning sun and letting it bathe me, and it feels so healing. We have this story about the sun now that it's a carcinogen, and which it can be. But it's also then you can forget that all life comes from the sun, and all of the order in our world is regulated by the sun, and you forget that part.
Yeah, it's the only biological constant in the last like
it,
8 billion years. A lot of things have come and go, but
it
that
sets the
that's been there.
patterns, it organizes nature, all those things. I hope we'll do a podcast one day where I'll ask you questions about the sun.
Awesome.
Does that sound good? Okay,
Sounds good,
great.
but I'm glad that you're getting your battery recharged.
Oh, it feels so good. What are we talking about today?
Well, speaking of sun, today we're going to spend some time talking about nature and maybe talking about well, why are you teaching this medicine called nature-based medicine? Why is it important? Is this going to be a podcast episode that's only relevant for hippies, and everyone else can leave it?
Who knows? It could just be for hippies. Who knows? I was a hippie once. Were you?
Uh, Probably not technically, given when I was born.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
I was born earlier, so I did go through that. I had hair down my back and so forth.
uh,
Great. Let's talk about nature today.
Yeah, so let's talk about nature. So maybe first, because nature is a word that gets used a lot, but I always feel like people might mean different things by it. So what do you mean when you talk about nature?
That is a great question because, as you say, it's an idea that there are many concepts of. It's also changed over time. It's one of those words we all assume we know what we're talking about, but we're often talking about different things. And what they were talking about in the early texts in the Neijing about nature, this was very different than the way we understand it in modern life. The word nature comes from natus, or to be born, something that gives birth. And traditionally, there was more of a process understanding of nature, I think, especially in traditional cultures. But up until the industrial scientific revolution, the way the term nature was used was really as a thing that gives birth to everything. Or, as in the Neijing, we'd say it's the birthing of everything and also the governance of everything is happening in nature. Um, Later, if you look in a modern dictionary now, you will see this definition. It's the material things of the world, which is really interesting. And then there's a distinction between things that are made by human beings and things that are, natural in a certain way. So our understanding of nature has really changed quite a bit from a enveloping, birthing, governing process to a collection of things, and that's really changed how we understand nature as something to be used, perhaps parts of things that can be used for our benefit. There's a very interesting sentence which I always thought that if we had changed the wording of that sentence, the entire world would be different. And that's this, the sentence I'm talking about. It's in Genesis. And it's the one that says, "And God said, let us make our human beings in our own image, our likeness, and let them rule over the fishes of the sea and the fowl of the heaven," and so forth. And there's that word rule, which is a Hebrew word, yirdu, and it means to govern or to rule. It's here you often see the power of stories. Like, for example, if you go to Sunday school, this is being taught all over the world for centuries, God gave nature to human beings so that human beings could rule over them as a God, which is really the emphasis of that sentence. And how would our world be different if it said, God created human beings and nature upon the same image, but asked human beings to take care of nature? If we just change one sentence, I think the world would have been a much different place. So if we look at modern versions of nature, that are embedded in our stories about capitalism and about things versus patterns. We've talked a little bit about that before. And then nature simply becomes a resource to be used to create monetary gain, grow companies, and throw the toxicity out the window. And
Mm.
that's clearly, a pretty bad story. So there are a lot of different stories, and the story of the Neijing about nature is something quite different. Maybe we can talk about that. But how does that sound so far?
It's, helpful for getting us up to speed, these different ways that we understand it. And when you talk about, throwing toxicity out the door, this just to kind of pause there, this gets into a much larger theme of, I guess, what are called externalities and your level of zoom. So if for any story or any problem you're trying to solve or anything you're looking at, when you change your focus, how zoomed in you are and how zoomed out you are, everything changes. And that's often the difference in perspectives that people have. So, this story that you're talking about that's so pervasive that nature's a resource to be used, it requires you to be zoomed in. And as soon as you step back, then you can see the, Antarctica side mound of plastic in the Pacific Ocean, and you see it, and then you know that that story doesn't work. It's missing important information.
Yeah, and we'll get into this more when we talk about stories, but we talk about the enveloping story, which is like the water the fish swims in, and then the story that's right in front of them, and they're always influencing one another. And so we still have the enveloping story about capitalism and nature as a resource to sell, basically. And then we have the zoomed in one. So then we see like, and then it becomes used as a marketing tool, where oil companies will be touting their green initiatives and things like that.
Is that called greenwashing?
Greenwashing, right?
Yeah.
Greenwashing. But really, we're on the precipice of a very serious ecological crisis, and it has to do with and a lot of it has to do with how we navigate our stories about nature. So, one of the ideas of my work and other people too is that currently we're actually drowning in information. We're choking on information. There's so much information. A lot of it's of dubious quality. We don't really know how to navigate it, but there's a drought. There's a real scarcity of organizing stories that can organize information in ways that serve humanity and the planet. So really, we don't need any more information at the moment. We're already drowning in it. It's like one of those plastic piles. But what we don't have is the stories that can organize the information in ways that serve human heartedness and our relationships to nature. And at the moment, the stories about nature are central to that dialogue. So, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think, I just wanna speak to something that maybe I don't know, I was thinking and some, listeners might be thinking too, that often when we get into discussions about this, there often gets to be like this pendulum swing of, like, polarization between, those who value nature versus those who value capitalism, or those who value, going back into the woods versus those who value progress, and actually, what I want to speak to is that a healthy organizing story really can accommodate all of those. It's not either or.
Exactly. And actually, you can retell the stories of capitalism,
Yeah.
and the story of capitalism does not serve us or the people who work in capitalism. That the greatest good is the shareholders profit, and you do anything in a cutthroat way to get it, no matter if it's even shady or slightly illegal. But you can also say that there are things in the world that need to be done, and people need to be doing things. In Chinese text it says it's important for a human being to be doing something. And if you have a business that is of service in a certain way. Maybe it's making shoes, but in a way, people need shoes to walk. So you can retell the story of capitalism and the people that own the businesses that are providing kind of a sacred space for people to do something that's of service to others. So even in the story of capitalism, we can
Mhm.
really retell that story. And of course, embedded behind all this is another story that we need to change, that the greatest good is always about growth,
Right.
which is ridiculous. In Western medicine, there is an illness characterized by unlimited growth, and it's called cancer,
Answer.
and it kills you. Nature is about breath and seasons and waking and going to sleep and the beauty that comes from that and the light that emerges within that. And all aspects of that breath are sacred, as we say. And so if you're only on the growing phase, nature is going to kill you. It's going to invoke things that break you down because it prioritizes breath. And so if one part's out of balance, it will invoke the other side, the breaking down part, so that it can breathe again.
You've spoken about this before. It's like in modern times, we just are inhaling all the time. We're
Right.
like addicted, and but of course, if you kind of explain it that way, like, well, if you were just inhaling and not exhaling, like that would be really uncomfortable pretty quickly.
Right, and here's another thing about growth. In Chinese thinking, if you want something to grow, you don't plant something. You first look for something to die.
Hmm.
That means if you want something good in the springtime, you attend to autumn time. That means if I want to change something or make a new business or grow in a certain way, the first thing I do is look at what is no longer needed and let it die, because that makes space for the next breath. So and occasionally I'll be looking around in the media sphere and I'll see like, oh, there's a revolutionary new idea that maybe economies should not be always growing, but they should be balanced. And I'm like, oh, obviously, we're at such a limited stage with this, which is also a reason to feel good, actually, because we're at such a baby step place in our understanding of our operating system and our stories and all that. There's so much to be improved. Um,
So what's interesting here is you're sharing ideas about nature, but we're talking about economics. It sounds like some of these ideas are fairly widely applicable to different areas, not just health.
so, I mean, you've studied this too, and the secret sauce of this is it's telling you the unified model of how all things work.
Mm.
And that is the idea that all things are motion, and motion is transformation. So things are moving and transforming all the time. Even when we look into our cosmos through cosmology and physics, we know that 96% of the cosmos, we don't see it. It's about motion and transformation. We don't even understand it. Dark matter, dark energy, where things come from. Only a small fraction are the things. So if you understand the patterning that make the things, then it's applicable to everything: economics, teaching children, healthcare, politics, city planning. What's the meaning of life? What is the meaning of love? What are relationships? It's because it's basically baked into everything. And so that's the real power of the early Chinese writings in the Neijing. It's like, and sometimes I talk about that as the world before the veil and after the veil, meaning that there's a whole world of things turning and transforming and moving into different conformations. And then when we're born, when we take our first breath, we move into the world of things. And that's the world after the veil. The world of things comes from the world before the veil. If we don't understand the world before the veil, then we're just like the wise men holding the elephant, trying to feel the elephant, trying to measure things and figure out and we're always kind of lost, and so forth. Yeah. There's a quote from E.O. Wilson here I pulled up. I love his writings. And humanity today is like a waking dreamer caught between the fantasies of sleep and the chaos of the real world. The mind seeks but cannot find the precise place and hour. We have created a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. We thrash about. We are terribly confused by the mere fact of our existence and a danger to ourselves and the rest of life. So that's a little bit bracing, but I think he states it very well. But there's another issue here when we talk about nature, because it can be overwhelming for anybody to, especially now that we have cell phones and things, we can just stare at them and it's kind of a lot more pleasing than thinking about the way things are. And also people are arguing about, climate change, all those things. And I like what Gary Snyder said, which is, if when we talk about doomsdays and we make people and we speak from fear-based points of view, it's good for getting political ends and things like that, scaring people and so forth. But the way to have transformation is to love, and that means to love nature. So sometimes they say any moment we're not speaking a love poem to the world, it's a wasted moment. It's very so instead of like arguing about it, saying this, the end is coming, it's coming, it's coming, you got to do it now, you got to do it now, and then most of us are powerless and we just feel worse. Start with love and start with locality. Means start in your garden. Don't heal the world. Start with your neighbor.
Mm.
And from that, great transformation can come.
Wow. These are really, really powerful ideas. And so what does the Neijing say about nature?
This is really interesting. I've been studying that book now for 20 years. And when I first started studying, I thought it was a medical textbook. I thought I'd go in and tell me how to treat a cold, what acupuncture points to use, blah, blah, blah. It ain't like that. Now, and when you learn Chinese medicine, it's all about the point combinations for headaches and dysmenorrhea, all that stuff. The Neijing has very little of that. It talks a lot about nature, and it talks a lot about techniques. It talks about techniques, and it talks about theory, but it doesn't tell you much about how to do things. And that's one reason that people have walked away from it and said it's old, it doesn't really help. But they're missing the point. And what I began to see over time is, well, what they're talking about nature, and they're talking about the patterns of motion of nature and transformation. And what I now say is, it's the world before the veil. And so it's this incredible manual and look, parting the curtain behind the world about how the universe operates. And then the Neijing has an interesting language. It's often moving between levels. And
Mhm.
the three main levels they move between when they're describing this world before the veil of nature, one is the world of the cosmos. So just we call in nature-based medicine, aging nature-based medicine, our new medicine, we call that the universal base patterns. So if you look at all the things in nature, and because we think about things rather than processes now, it looks like the world is created and defined by an infinite number of processes and things. But that doesn't seem to be true. It seems it's actually that the universe operates on basic principles, which are fairly few, and they permeate the whole cosmos. So in the Neijing, the first level they talk about, they'll say in the heavens. And they're talking about how this intangible motion, like the water in the ocean, is moving, that we don't see anything in it. And then it comes to the second level, which is the world of nature. And these patterns come into the world and they mix with the local events on the planet, and they create the world of nature. So we were talking about, what does nature mean? And in early Chinese thought, it was the space between heaven and earth. We call it the qi jiao, the qi intersection. And there was the more material earth aspect, and there was the patterning that comes from the cosmos. And they essentially are having sex or making love. They're turning together. And the language is sex based, really. It's like they move on each other, they turn. And from that, the world of the 10,000 things is created. And 10,000 things is kind of another name for the world of nature. So the world of nature is a child of the patterns of the cosmos and the patterns of the earth when they make love and they create each other. And there's this way that the forms of nature come into being around the patterns of movement. So one of the rules of this world, or how the world before the veil becomes the world after the veil, is that the physical forms of nature organize themselves in ways to ease the passage of the intangible processes that are moving through them. Just like in a sand dune, if the wave was blowing and you'd see the crests of the sand forming to make a way for them. And from that, the forms of the world come into being. And one of the things we always have to remember, because as modern people, we're coming from a thing based world. Like, I'm a thing, you're a thing. We know the world by measuring things. And then we're like the blind man and the elephant. We have to remember we train our mind so that when we see a thing like a body, we're actually seeing motion in form. So it's still moving, but in a slower way, and it's tangible. So the Neijing is often moving back and forth. And then the third level it's talking about is the body, because it is a healthcare book. So they'll say, in the heavens, it's like this. In nature, it's like this. In the body, it's like this. So, for example, the stars, the constellations make a music, kind of a symphony, and that symphony filters down into the terrestrial biosphere and it mixes with the energies of the earth. And it first creates semi tangible things like clouds and so forth, and patterns like wind and humidity and stuff, so forth. And that comes into the forms of the world. So, what was wind coming from the constellation of the eastern direction's music then turns into plants as it becomes more tangible. And in the body, that turns into your connective tissue body. So, what we're looking at is basic patterns of motion and breath in different ways. And nature is the first thing we see. But here's another really important thing about this. I don't want to drone on, jump in if you have a question. Um, but most people today, if you ask them what nature is, how they feel about it, they will say it's something separate from them. We also say we're not animals, also, by the way, things like that. So nature is something, that you go out on the weekend and you go hiking, with your friends, and then you come back to the city and your house. So you go back and forth to nature. Well, that's clearly not true. The same patterns that make plants, rivers, streams, clouds, make my body. And so we say, we are nature, nature is us. There is no separation. The only separation comes from the stories we tell. It's not actually true. And sometimes people will say, like, you'll see a picture on the internet of a plant and with its veins, and then a picture of the blood vessels, and someone on TikTok will go, "Isn't it amazing? The leaves and the blood vessels look the same." And of course they do, because they're made on the exact same patterns. And so the next step is not that we're separate from nature, but then people say, well, we're like nature, you know, like the leaf is like the blood vessels. That's not true either. What's true is we are nature. And this is kind of an advanced way of thinking. You have to take time to wrap your mind around this, get used to it. This changes everything. So the music in the Eastern constellations makes a sound. It creates wind. Wind creates motion. The motion creates the motion in form of plants, how they move. That motion moves into your body and creates your liver system, your connective tissue body, your structure. That's all one aspect of breath, just in different forms. So we don't say, for example, we don't say like the liver is like springtime. We say the liver is springtime in organ form. This is really important because it means whatever's happening in nature is happening to me, whether or not I have air conditioning and an air filter, and the fastest way to restore the health of humanity is to restore the health of nature. And also, not to go too far, when we restore our body or through our healthcare work, we help nature restore because we're directly connected. So you might think, well, one person doing qigong doesn't matter, but what if a million people did it? That actually helps nature breathe again because we are nature. I think that's probably enough.
That's it's fascinating. It's it's beautiful and it's important, and it is one of those much bigger ideas that you might hear it and kinda get it immediately and, like, feel it, or you might need to sit with it. I was recently, thinking of you and your teaching, as I often do when I'm out in my travels, and I'm, spending a lot of time lately, studying the brain and the nervous system, which it seems to be my spiritual path, or at least how I, function a little bit better as an adult. And one of the ideas I came across recently, which kind of shows this kind of, because you talk about the universe as being a resonance scape, that we're kind of resonating and moving together. That um, when you hear a sound, like let's say a 100 hertz sound, and there's an area in your brain that hears sounds called the temporal lobe, it's vibrating at 100 hertz. It's the same thing for all of our senses. So when we sense something, the parts of our brain and our body that are able to sense them literally vibrate with them, which it's almost like when I say it, it seems like perhaps obvious, but this is not actually something that's very widely thought about or discussed or understood, whether that's in neurology circles or in the wider circles. But it's another way, I suppose, of apprehending this idea that it's like this like literal physical vibratory connection. It's not like an abstract. This is something you can actually see and measure.
Yeah, when E.O. Wilson says we have an emotional system based on hunter gathering, it's really true. Our nervous system developed on being able to look at things and kind of respond to the environment. But our brain tricks us into thinking the world is things. And the world has things. But number one, that's a small part of the world and the universe. And number two, the nature of things is not what we think they are. And so, really, and this is what we call in nature based medicine a long learning thing. It means I can tell you this in a podcast and it might be inspiring, and tomorrow you may remember it, the third day you might forget it. But if you come to it day and day through like studying classical texts or working with a teacher or something like that, over a year, 2 years, you will see, being reminded of it daily, it will completely change who you are and how you move through the world and how you see things. That's a challenge in today's world when everything moves so fast. And so a lot of long learning things that used to be in traditions they're challenging for us now. But the good thing is we're being pushed to a brink. And so we're looking for answers. And so it may be a time when we can come back to these. Yeah.
Yeah. I often wonder if, talking about our hunter gatherer system, that when we are stressed, which can include novelty, it kind of collapses us into this way of seeing more of that we're surrounded by things. That when we're relaxed and our gaze is open and expansive and we're connected, we're kind of more going with the
We're related.
flow,
Yeah.
and we're kind of more perceiving less thinginess and more
And
waviness.
that goes with the left and right brain
Yeah,
issues you talk a lot about. It's true. And, what's really hard for people right now, and I say we're not very good at understanding our operating system. We were just born. We think we're, very old and advanced and the most sophisticated animal on the planet. But in our current version, we were just born, like at the end of the last ice age, 11,000 years ago or something like that. And then we had writing 5,000 years ago. I mean, we're just born and in this new version. And there was no manual about the operating system. And so we're still operating, as E.O. Wilson says, on these older patternings. And the problem is, like if you're in hunter gathering, as you know, like your nervous system is tuned into any fast moving thing in your periphery. It's either coming to get you or it's something you're going to get, you know? And so that's really deep wired into our operating system. And now it's been taken advantage of. So we have phones with flashing lights and the editing speeds are so fast and everybody's exhausted because they're keying into that one thing of what it used to be when we were out on the plains trying to catch our dinner and avoid being eaten. And now it's just being overdone so much that people's nervous systems are exhausted. This is what I mean when I say we don't understand our operating system. And so we need to upgrade our understanding a bit. Yeah.
So one of the ideas you just mentioned, which is related, very much related to nature, you were talking about the constellations in the east playing music and coming down and becoming plants, and then that becoming our sinew system. And first of all, when I originally learned those ideas, it was more like as like a grid to memorize. And what you're describing is this way of understanding it that is really tying it all together in a much more, oh, I don't know, it's kind of more like practical and visceral way. And I was curious if you wanted to describe the other directions.
Oh, well, the music comes down from the Eastern constellations and it creates what we call the five phases, which we just talked about. So, as we had that podcast last week, the five elements or the five phases really means the music that comes down from the constellations that organizes the seasons and the patterns of nature. So, we want to think about the universe as being a humming place. I always say it's like hum, it's like a resonance, and the resonance has different it moves into different conformations. So in the east, when the eastern constellations come down through the wuxing and play the music of the east, it creates the opening patterns of springtime. Things come out from hibernation, they come back out, they're young, they're opening up. In the southern direction, they create the full expression, maturation, and sharing in communality of the summertime. In the west, the autumn constellations make the music of autumn time and the letting go. Remember, I said if you want something to grow, you need to let something go first. And the north corresponds to wintertime and the storing and the moving between the hidden and the revealed. And it's the place where the embryo of breath is formed. So it's where the restoration is formed so that when the spring comes again, it can be born again. And these ideas about resonance, for example, they're actually the Neijing description of a resonant universe is totally aligned with, or as far as I know, our current understanding of the way the world actually is through the model of quantum mechanics. And that was developed in the 1920s. So, in a certain way, we're like 100 years behind in medicine and our thinking. If we look at the psi function of the wave, for example, it's a resonance probability motion coherence kind of event. Then, and that's before the veil in a certain way. When we observe it, when we start to measure it, it becomes a thing all of a sudden and it moves into the thing based world. But the essential nature of the world is actually clouds of coherence and motion and relationships. And that's a very different way of looking at the world and nature. For example, if I look at a forest and I see a bunch of trees and think I could make a lot of money cutting those things down and turning them into paper, that's one thing. But if they're a resonance of which I am a resonance, in quantum mechanics also, there's this thing about the observer and the observed disappears. Because if the world is a resonance, then we're just different coherences of that resonance. And this underlies a deeper question that we have to navigate to survive. And that's the question about separation or communion, which is essentially, and it's the question that underlies, most spiritual questions. And it is, are we the same? Or are we, we have a shared space, or are we different? Are we things we fight with each other to win? Or are we, like if I'm fighting in a war, I'm actually killing myself in a certain way, or if I'm arguing with someone on the internet, I'm actually arguing with myself. Or if I'm polluting nature, I'm actually polluting myself. You know, these are all more advanced ways of being once we understand the operating system better. And we really need to be evolving to there as much as we can. These are hard concepts, though, I'd say, too. These are not simple concepts. But as Richard Feynman says, if you can understand it, you could explain it to a child. And the basic principles you can. It's hard. I think it's hard conceptually because the way our brains are wired, we it constantly misleads us because we didn't get our instruction manual about the operating system.
Mhm.
Like one of those things is when you see something, like when you put your child to sleep and you look into their eyes, you're not actually seeing the child. You're seeing a story that your brain makes from vibrations, and it creates an image in your mind. We'll talk about that later. So there's all these things that are really key if we're to determine how we move forward and if we move forward.
As you're sharing these insights, like, part of me feels like, these are stories. I feel like these are stories that whose, like, time has come, that there will be people listening, and we talked about this before that, when you share certain ideas, it's almost like on a cellular level, people can feel it. It's not like you're coming up with something and trying to convince them and making an argument. You're describing something that perhaps it's almost more like they're remembering it. So it feels like even just spending time with ideas like this is helpful, but then there's also another part of me that's like, how can people listening make this practical? Because these are very big ideas, and talk about the universe resonating together. You're like, okay, well, what do I do? And then it can be this sort of almost part of you wants to retreat and part of you wants to move forward. And so, yeah, what can people listening do with this understanding? Even if it
Yeah,
takes some time to kind of fully absorb it.
I think that's really true. And one of my philosophies of teaching is you can't teach anybody anything deep that they don't already know themselves. So that teaching is actually a re-remembering of resonance. It means my words are resonance, and somewhere in your body is a seed that remembers it, and it starts to vibrate with the words. And it's the growing of the seed that transforms things. It's not me convincing you that I'm right. What's powerful about these words, if we're talking about the patterns that make the universe, is that everything in your body is templated on that pattern. And your body's been living in a world where people have been saying it's about things and this, that, and the other thing, and nature's about resources. And your body's kind of sitting on the sideline and going, I don't really believe this. And then when someone comes along and say it's actually about breath and motion and light, and nature, and you are nature, and the body gets up and goes, yeah. And that happens in our healthcare clinic a lot. The patients' bodies, you can tell them a story about their cytokines, and they kind of go, yeah, okay, whatever. You tell them about this, and they go, yeah,
Mhm.
because they feel it. It is also a problem and a challenge in teaching because some of these ideas are pretty esoteric.
Mm.
How do you teach? But fortunately, in the healthcare clinic, we need to know all these theories to teach them. But what do we look at in the healthcare clinic? Restoring ecology. So that means, and you can do that in your garden. You can do that in your house. You can do that in your body. They're all made on ecological principles. So when we teach people, we don't say, go to the heart of the universe and conjure up this. Well, we do that a little bit, but what we're actually saying is where do the rivers run in your body, which are the blood vessels, and they were divided into watersheds in the Neijing. And how do you assess whether a watershed is healthy or not? And where can you see where its flow? And what's the quality of its water? And what's the principles of its health? So it's all about ecological restoration. And that's also where we can tie our medicine directly into many good and smart people who are working on ecological restoration directly. For
Mm.
example, soil restoration has direct correlations to human health. River conservation. We're going to have a class in July down in California, and the first day we're going out to the river with a river specialist to teach us about that river because the same principles are there for how we work with the body and its blood rivers system. And then
One thing.
it can be as simple as like the universe is a breath. Take a breath. You know, does it move? Where it doesn't move, you're ill in a certain way or imbalanced, and restore that breath. It can be that simple or very complicated. Yeah.
I mean, I think with an idea like that, it's one that, people can test, You can see if, seeing the universe as a breath or everything as a breath is helpful or not. I think one thing I've been impressed by, learning from you is That and this I've seen noticed this with, other teachers that I admire as well, is that when you understand something from a principles level, then you can be a little bit more, I wanna say flexible and pragmatic in the specific tools you use because you know what you're trying to do, versus being so tied into a specific tool because you're focused on
Right.
things again.
And we ask, actually, we ask very simple questions in the clinic. Where is breath moving? Where is there space in tissue? If tissue's like compacted, it can't breathe, right? It can't move with the patterns of the universe. Um, does the breath originate in the right place? Are the rivers flowing like that? It's much more tangible that way. Yeah.
This is very cool. So, so what are some other things that we need to understand about nature? So we've talked about our kind of cultural current story, which is a bit sick, and honestly, I feel like at least I mean I'll speak for myself, but also people listening. It's like a lot of people don't believe it, but it's almost like the story itself has been sold in order to perpetuate. Because it's like people do benefit from harvesting and over harvesting nature, and then they convince other people that that's how it should be done. And then we've talked a bit about some of the ideas from the Neijing, and it's
Right. And here's an interesting thing. We're still at a basic level of how we understand stories, and the first thing is we confuse them for reality. Like my opinion's not a story, it's reality, and so forth. The other thing is there can only be one, you know whereas there can be many, like when we get better with the operating system. So for example, the thing based story is a way of assembling observations about the world, which has certain benefits.
Mm,
It's not all bad, you know it's just limited in a certain way. When we look at the story of capitalism, for example, it's not all bad, or it doesn't have to all be bad. What we see in capitalism is that money becomes a mana, a substitute for actual life, and because there's an impoverishment in actual life, we want mana, which is a kind of food falling from heaven or something like that. What do I mean by that? What is it required for you to have a wonderful life where you feel an abundance and you're full and you couldn't want for anything? Well, you need a house and safety and food and water, all those things. But what you really need is breath and light. Our bodies are built on breath and light, and when we have those two things, we are full. If you don't have those two things, especially if you've been told a story that what's really important is money or something else, and you head down that road because you're part of that tribe, and then you feel the impoverishment of it, and then you need more of it. And then it just becomes about getting that. And that's the sickness. So, what I mean by that is when my point of view is everybody I deal with, they're doing the best with the tools they have. That's one thing. And also that all stories have good and bad aspects.
mm.
And so it's like when we talk about the story of the Neijing in nature, we're telling a different story. It's much richer, more accurate. It helps us move through the world in a different way.
I mean, when you were describing stories, what came to mind is that that there's also this tree-like structure to stories themselves, and I think maybe part of what's so confusing about being a modern person is that people are out on the leaves with these little tiny stories, and they're not very satiating or fulfilling, and they're confusing, and they're going from leaf to leaf. And when you kind of come up the tree and into the trunk and the root, there aren't that many stories. Different uh, different spiritual traditions, different religious traditions really had different versions of similar stories, or even the book escapes me now, but I was in a bookstore a few months ago, and it was a book about like the seven different structures of stories. It's like there are seven stories. Here they are. Here's different takes on them, and it's not wrong. And so it's kind of beautiful that again, even talking about story follows the structure of the story that we're talking about, which is these universal patterns that are everywhere.
Right. And when we get more advanced with stories, and hopefully we'll have a whole talk on stories, instead of arguing about which one's right and then killing another person to defend that story, which is a really primitive way of, being, we can ask this: how does this story change how we move through the world, how we walk through the world? And we can begin to value stories in how they change our experience of being alive. So, for example, the nature based story of resonance and communion, its value is that it changes how you walk through the world, how we walk through the world. It's not about an argument about which one's right, because also, when I go to have an operation, I'm really glad my surgeon knows about things, you know. So they all have their value, but it's also, how do we take a bunch of different stories and serve something called humanity and nature and the world? And we're not having that discussion hardly at all right now. So
Mm.
we're drowning in as I say in the beginning, the information. It's overwhelming us now with AI. It's just like you can't, it's like you're drowning in it. But the organizing stories that put it together so that there's more humanity, there's humaneness, human heartedness in the world, or flourishing of nature and so forth. Those discussions aren't there because we're very primitive in our operating system, our understanding of the operating system.
These are important discussions to have, though. It's really,
Oh, and the thing we have going for us is like people know we're against the wall. Like when I work with patients, if the patient is like has a pretty good job and a nice family and plays tennis every Saturday and like goes to the wine country, whatever, their desire and need to change deeply may not be very deep. You know, Look at people in hospice care though. They are ready to think about things. And that's kind of where we are. We're kind of entering hospice in a certain way. And the good thing about that is we are really ready to change. And I say, like, there's a drought of good stories. I really see it like people are thirsty. It's like they haven't been able to drink from something that's substantial, that organizes things in a hearted, human hearted, in a hearted way. And so when they hear it, they go, wow. So this is also a moment of great potential transformation.
that it definitely there is, that feeling of, you can have the best whatever in the world, but there is a timing factor, so it does feel like
Timing and
there's.
rhythm, everything. Yeah.
So
And
I don't know if this is, too big of a question to ask at this point, but do you wanna describe specifically some of these patterns that nature has?
oh, yeah, I can talk about some of them.
You talked about one,
Yeah, I
the
mean,
the big one.
one of them is that the universe is moving, all the time and
Yeah,
transforming, and that
and breathing.
and breathing, and forms are forming themselves around that breath in ways to ease the circulation of that breath through them, and that forms are actually not things, but patterns of motion, intangible appreciation.
That are moving slowly.
Right. So, like, I'm here, you're here, we look like a thing, but in 100 years, we won't be here. 10,000 years, my computer will melt, go away, in so many billions of years, the solar system will be gone, and so forth. So, it's a time scale issue. So, that's one thing. A simple thing is that all breath motions in the universe arise out of a root, and they move out to an expression, and they return to a root. And that idea of root and outward expression is baked into every breath motion in the cosmos, whether it's out in the nebula and you can't see the motion of the breath, or whether it's in the structure of a tree or a plant that's mirroring that with a root ball and an outer leaves and branches, or whether it's a human body where we say in Chinese medicine, your pelvis is your root, and then it spreads out into your limbs and your fingers and toes and things like that. That's a basic motion, and there's just a lot of wisdom there. It means that we're supported by root motions. And if we want to live a healthy life, an engaged life, a fulfilling life, we start with our roots. And for us, our roots are the patterns of the cosmos, the patterns of nature, teachings that have come before, writings and traditions of people, our family that have created us, our culture. There's roots in all those things. And then they move out. And any good plant is going to start with its roots and move out to its expressions. What's happened in with the Industrial Revolution, because we got so good at things, we didn't think we needed roots anymore, or nature, or traditional stories, because we got it all in hand now, because we can just make nature do what we want. And we got a kind of time sickness, as we've talked about before, where things reverse themselves. And now we think our root is in the future, and we think that our past doesn't really matter. And it also means, like you said, we're way out on the leaves of things, but we don't really understand how they work. So we're like hungry ghosts, always trying to move around, but not being fed. And so we have to just turn that around. It doesn't, to look to the past doesn't mean, and know where your roots are, doesn't mean that new discoveries aren't happening in science. It's just that they're built on a root structure of
Mhm.
things that created it. So that would be one example.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Anything else to add about nature and her breath pattern and, the patterns that form us, connection, separation?
I would just say this, it is a difficult time. And as I said before, the two things that keep me hopeful, number one is we're using so little of our potential. We don't understand our operating system at all. We're working at a very primitive level. It can be so much better. We have so much room for improvement. And the second thing is nature and its breath motions are so powerful and resilient, and they move towards healing, and they move towards the restoration of balance. And so when we align with them, immediately things start to get better. We're going against them, trying to kill them off, poison them, things like that. But if we can turn around and move with them, wow, it's then the wind is in your sails, and things can start working with us again.
That sounds like a good way to go.
Yeah, but we have to have these conversations first.
Absolutely.
Communally, yeah. So this is great.
Very cool. Well, thank you,
All right,
and, I'll look we'll look forward to the next one.
sounds good. Thanks for talking with me today, and I'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.